Do you know what they said about me when I thought I was alone? It's time for a nursing home. Sell the house. Buy that cabin. Like a live wire through my ribs. That laugh, the man's calm voice, the clink of silverware I'd polished for 30 years. I heard every word, and for a long minute the room turned into nothing but the hardwood I'd sanded with my own hands. If this story grabs you, hit like and subscribe. There's power in being heard. Stick around. If you've ever been taken for granted, this one's for you. They thought I was a burden. I could tell you when it started to change. The small things that slid like ice across a kitchen counter until everything cracked. Or I could start with the night the world tilted and the floor opened under my feet. But both are true. One explains the other. So let me take you back, slow and sure, to a life I built with my own hands. My name's Tom. I built the house, board by board, nail by nail. Not in the poetic way people say they built a life. I literally built it. The lot on Maple Ridge was raw land when Lillian and I first saw it. We measured, argued about the kitchen layout, drank bad coffee on a cement block, and laughed about how small our first mortgage would make us feel like grown-ups. Lillian used to call the house our island, even when the island was just a sink and a pile of blueprints. She had this laugh that made the whole place feel safe. She loved quilts and Lily, and the way the light hit the bay window in late afternoon. I take pride in the little things. We laid the floors together, stained them until they shone, and for 22 years those floors kept every step of our lives. Our children's first runs, the echo of parties, the silence of the last year after Lillian got sick. We raised Claire and Adam there. Claire liked the porch swing. She'd come home from college and sit there like she belonged to no one but that faded cushion. Adam was practical, could fix a fuse, change a tire. We made mistakes, of course. I say we because marriages are never one thing. They are two people tripping over each other, sometimes stepping on toes. When Lillian was alive, things were a kind of chaotic love that smoothed out at night. People noticed. Neighbors would nod as if they'd seen the picture of a family they respected. The house was more than wood and paint. It was proof, to me, that I'd done something right. And then Lillian died. I am not going to dramatize it. Cancer is cruel in ways that no story can do justice to. There are days you remember the brightness of someone's voice and others that are a smear of hospital sleep, blood tests, and too many receipts. After she passed, there was a hollow with her scent in the linen closet, a chair that looked like a body might still fold into it. The first winter without her felt like a long hallway with all the doors closed. Claire and Adam came around. They hugged me, brought casseroles. They were attentive in the immediate way children are when grief is proximate and visible. But grief changes shape. It hardened into something else, a calculation. I noticed the first small thing the year after Lillian's funeral. Claire arriving for a weekend and staying 3 weeks, helping with bills and making mental notes about the boiler. She volunteered to take Mom's silverware for safekeeping and left a box at their house. Adam, in between jobs, needed a place to stay for a while. I was lonely, honest, but never stupid. I liked having my kids around. I'd bought them meals. I'd consigned a small loan for Adam when he couldn't get credit. I thought those acts were part of being a father. I thought that gratitude would be the currency of family. The truth was more corrosive. My kindness became a ledger balance others could draw from without asking. The signs built like a leak, missed calls at odd hours, excuses about being too tired to come for Sunday dinner, small comments that hinted at impatience. Dad, maybe you should think about downsizing. We can't keep dealing with this. They said it as if we included me. I was the object of the sentence, not a subject. Their eyes slid over me the way city folks look at an old house with potential. That night when I was scraping the last of the meatloaf off my plate, the plate Lillian used to leave in the sink because she said, "It softens the fat," Claire didn't hang up. The recliner she'd let me keep after Lillian died still smelled faintly of lavender. It was Lillian's chair, the one where she loved to read by the lamplight. I sank into it, the leather creaking with the map of my life etched into it. I had the radio on low. I should have noticed sooner. I should have been expecting. But no, I did not expect to become an inventory item. Claire's voice came through the phone. Right, just a note too high. The tone people use when they tell each other small untruths. "He's getting forgetful," she said, and laughed like it was the weather. Then a man's voice, flat, practical. Not Adam's voice, though Adam would later play his part. This voice was cool, measured, the voice of someone calculating profit in the place where husband's memory used to be. "It's time for a nursing home," he said. "The house is worth close to $900. We could sell it, put him somewhere decent, and finally buy that cabin we've been looking at." The word cabin wasn't what made my hands go numb. It was the matter of factness, the sense that the subject of the sentence, me, was an equation to be resolved. I heard the phone slip out of Claire's hand in the background, a soft thud like a dropped spoon. There were muffled footsteps. "He won't notice," she said. "Dad barely sleeps in that chair anymore. He's always calling the neighbors by the wrong name." I pressed my palm to my chest then, as if I could press the words back into my ribs. The recliner's arms felt like Lillian's arms used to, solid, impossible to move. I felt the hardwood under my feet, the very boards we'd sanded, the grain I'd polished, until it reflected the light. How could they pretend the house was only money? How could they think the life it held could be priced and moved like furniture? I sat there for a long time, listening to them talk about the house as if it were a commodity. The laughter swung around the word cabin, again like a promise. My vision tunneled to the mantel, Lillian's picture in its brass frame. Her eyes looked smaller in the lamplight, but they were still hers. I found myself whispering to the portrait, like a madman, "You hear that, Lil? They'd sell it." The house answered only with the creak of a stair and the whisper of a draft through a window I hadn't yet resealed. At some point that night I found the folder. I don't know why I kept things, I suppose because Lillian would have liked it. The folder was ordinary. Receipts, mortgage statements, a photocopy of a deed. I unfolded it on the dining table and ran my thumb over the embossed title. The deed, my name, clear. It sat like a small, quiet truth on paper. There's a kind of slow motion that happens when you realize someone has been talking about you like you're already gone. My hands felt heavy. My heart tried to leap, but all it could do was fold itself into itself like a pocket. I thought of all the times I'd helped Adam get back on his feet, of siding with Claire when she was flustered with the landlord. I'd done those things because I wanted to, because that's what you do, you help. But being generous is not a warrant for theft. There was a legal reality and a moral one, and neither of them included the cabin. I called Alan Pierce, the attorney Lillian and I had used years ago. He'd picked up on the second ring. "Tom," he said, and I could hear the afternoon in his voice, the noise of his office like someone tapping a keyboard in the next room. He knew us. He'd once helped Lillian draft a will the way people draft love letters, careful, a little formal, but warm. "It's in your name, Tom," he said. "If the title's clean, it's yours to sell or to keep. No one can move you without a court order. If they suggested selling because of your forgetfulness, that won't fly legally, not without conservatorship papers." There it was, the boundary. The paperwork that proved I still had agency, that I was a person with a signature and a legal identity, not a burden to be warehoused. I didn't call Alan to make a scene. I called because the world had become a ledger that needed a ledger keeper, and I needed to know what my columns looked like. He warned me there would be emotional damage. He warned me that children could make a case, and that sometimes families fought bitterly when money and memory tangled. "But," he said, "Tom, sometimes the best thing is to take care of what's yours, and make a plan that gives you the dignity to leave on your terms." Dignity. The word felt like dry linen on my skin, uncomfortable, but necessary. I didn't want to make them suffer more than their own conscience would. But their conversation, that loose, thoughtless thing, had cracked something inside me. It was not just an exchange about property. It was the idea that people you loved would willingly trade their loyalty for convenience, that hit deeper than money. That stung because I'd loved them. I'd done everything, the tuitions, the down payments, the small loans when jobs dried up. I'd been the scaffolding for their futures. No one scaffolds what they intend to collapse. I remember the next 3 days with an odd clarity that surprises me. I woke early, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder. The house was quiet in a way that felt disrespectful now, like it had been holding its breath. I walked through rooms, touching the banister where my hands had left grooves, tugging a drawer that still smelled faintly of Lillian's lavender. I measured in my head how many boxes I could cram into my little sedan without calling a mover. I made lists. I checked bank balances. I called the title company to make sure the paperwork was indeed clean. Each call stripped away the haze of shock and replaced it with a methodical clarity. On the second day, there was a knock. It was Claire, unannounced, with that practiced pity in her eyes that used to be affection. She came in carrying a casserole and a face made of concern, the same face people wear when they tell you something will be okay in the wrong way. "Dad," she said, hugging me with one arm, keeping a polite distance with the other. Even the hug felt measured. "We were worried. You haven't been answering like you used to." I could have told her I'd heard the phone call. I could have said, "So you were planning to sell my house." Instead, I wiped my hands on a towel and tried to sound reasonable. "I heard some things," I said. "We need to talk about boundaries." I hoped that would be enough to open a conversation where honest words could live. She smiled like someone practiced at deflection. "We only want what's best for you, Dad," she said. "We're worried about safety." Worry. The word came like a curtain between us. I thought of Lillian's voice, "Don't give her so much that she forgets to be grateful." It was a sharp, private memory, one of those phrases people tuck away like admonitions. I had always been practical. I'd assumed my children would understand that. After the call, worry was a new currency they used. That night I lay awake on the mattress Lillian and I had shared and listened to the house settle. The radiator hissed, then stopped. The moon painted a knife of light on the floor. I thought about selling, not because I wanted to, but because selling could be a way to reclaim a tidy, controlled ending. I thought about moving to someplace small where the landlord wouldn't mistake me for furniture. I thought about the idea of making a choice on my own terms instead of being packed like an old tool into a box labeled donate. Sleep came in short, clipped breaths. My mind kept returning to the notion of being invisible within my own family. Each memory was a little flare of shame and pride. Shame because I'd let things slide. Pride because I'd built something they wanted. I remembered the first night we moved in, how Lillian and I sat on the floor with a single lamp and a stack of takeout, and it occurred to me that the house had always been a stage for our better selves. I refused to be cast out without an audience. On the morning I decided outwardly to act, I found myself in the garage, running a hand over the workbench, where I'd sharpened tools for 4 decades. The smell of oil and sawdust was comfort. I had to be practical. There was a realtor I'd known at the Rotary Club, Daniel Cole, a man who specialized in quick closes for older properties. He'd told me once when business and civics overlapped. I dialed his number, not with a plan fully formed, but with a seed of one. I need to know how fast someone could buy a house if they had the cash, I said. He came that same afternoon with a clipboard, shoes that clicked in a way that said he was used to walking into judgments and leaving with keys. He looked at the house like a farmer looks at a field. Appraisal, yield, turnaround. Well-maintained, original owner, he said, as if he were gutting a trout, and the word was the most important part. You can get top dollar for a place like this. If you're open to a cash sale, I could have offers in a week. It was the kind of practical sentence lawyers and realtors use. It was also a lifeline. A cash sale meant no waiting for loans, no environment where greedy people might quietly intervene. The idea planted itself. Sell quick, take the money, move somewhere small and safe, on my terms. They'd assumed they could sell me like old paint. I could sell the paint and keep the color. But there was something else, a small burning recognition that I wanted them to feel the first free song of panic they'd wished upon me. Not to humiliate them, necessarily, though a little sting seemed fair, but to reconfigure the ledger so that the people who treated me like an expense would have to account for their own choices. That's when the plan began to form in firmer outline. I didn't do anything dramatic. No arson, no theft. I began with paperwork with the slow, patient acts of someone who understands that the law is a tool you can use to carve a future. And as I sat on the edge of my bed that evening, watching the sun lay itself across the floor I'd sanded, I felt something settle in my chest that had been missing since Lillian died. Agency. I picked up the phone to call Alan again. The next move was small but deliberate. I would not let them decide this story for me. I would make a choice. I would show them in a way they wouldn't expect that generosity is not a synonym for helplessness. I hung up the phone before dialing, my thumb resting over the number as if I could delay the moment. My fingers trembled in a way I would hardly admit to anyone. I wanted the shock to be clean and the moral to be unambiguous. And I wanted more than anything to keep Lillian's things. There are things you don't sell. The brass picture frame on the mantel, the quilts, the jar of buttons she used to collect. Those would come with me wherever I decided to land. I stood up and walked to the window that looked over the front yard. watching the maple's leaves shiver in a late breeze. It was quiet enough to hear my own pulse. I laced my fingers together and felt the calluses from years of hammering. This house had grand memories and small ones, warm and difficult. It had my work in it. No one had the right to auction that away as if it were an inconvenience. I dialed Alan's number. On the other end, his voice was patient. "Whatever you do, Tom, make it legal. Don't leave yourself open." He listened as I spoke in a voice that tried to be calm. I told him about the overheard call, about the dream of a cabin, about Claire's consolation casserole. He advised. I took notes. The plan was tight in its bones. Verify title, speak to a realtor who could close fast, find a small furnished place nearby, pack only what mattered, change the locks the day of closing, and if the offers came, sell. There was a tenderness in the absurdity of it. Me, at 70, running the logistics of a sale like some young hustler. There was also a satisfaction. I would not be moved like a piece of furniture. I would choose my future, and if there was a consequence, if my kids learned the cost of assuming, then perhaps the lesson would be practical as well as painful. That night, as I packed Lillian's jewelry box into a small brown case, I paused over her wedding band and remembered the feel of her hand in mine at the altar, the mispronounced minister, the laughter. The ring slid over my finger for a second, and the weight of it steadied me. I wrapped the ring in a handkerchief and tucked it away. Some things you keep close like talismans. Some things you keep out of reach because they prove you're still yourself. I locked the top drawer and went to bed with a plan that was not yet revenge, merely reclamation. I would take care of my affairs. I would protect what belonged to me. And when I woke up, the first thing I did was call a realtor who promised speed. They will not see this coming, I told myself. They think I am forgetful. They think I am a problem. Tonight, they sleep in a house that I own. Tomorrow, I begin to change the locks on their presumptions. The week between listing the house and the expected closing felt like walking through fog. Every step was familiar, every sight a relic, but distance hid the edges. The realtor, Daniel, moved with a kind of indifferent efficiency that both reassured and unnerved me. He talked in numbers, cash buyer, as is, fast close. He kept saying well-maintained, like a benediction, and I read it as truth and as an appraisal. The first time he used the words original owner, it made me feel younger, as if the house and I were still new things in the world. But logistics have a way of making you small. There were inspections, men in plastic booties and clipboards who walked through my life as if it were a property portfolio. They tapped the banister, opened cabinets, flipped switches with a practiced, unemotional curiosity. I followed them and watched their eyes skim over Lillian's crochet basket and the dent in the kitchen table where the favorite mug had once been. One of the inspectors called the wiring dated. Another complimented the kitchen's bones. They used words like opportunity and character. Character makes one sound a little worn, not loved. While they poked and prodded, I dotted the I's and crossed the T's. I went to the bank to set up the transfer instructions Daniel needed. Riverside Community Bank smelled like paper and boiled coffee. The teller, a young man with a scar along his jaw, asked if I wanted help with a cashier's check. I told him I wanted a wire and watched the words in his eyes shift from polite curiosity to a careful respect. Maybe he noticed the way my hands trembled when I signed the signature card, or maybe people's bones tell the rest of the story. Either way, the transfer felt like setting a domino in place. One push and the whole board would fall. My kids tried the usual gentle attacks: calls, concerned messages, visits under the pretense of help. Claire's texts arrived in waves. "How are you feeling? Did you see the doctor? We just wanted to help with packing." Her language was syrupy honey over barbed wire. Adam called less often, but when he did, his voice was short and brisk, as if he were trying on anger. Once he left a voice message where he referred to me as Dad, with the kind of clipped contempt people reserve for inconvenient relatives. I played his messages on loop like some terrible music and then deleted them. Deleting feels like cleaning a wound. You don't forget it, but the shape of it changes. There were nights when I wanted to call them and tell everything: the title, the realtor's estimate, the transfer instructions, the plan to move. I imagined standing in the doorway, telling them plainly how I'd felt when I'd heard Claire's laughter and a stranger's voice approve of selling my life. I'd rehearse words, measured, not cruel, that would carve their assumptions into memory. But making a spectacle would have let them make martyrs of themselves. I didn't want to give them that satisfaction. The plan was not about public humiliation. It was about taking back what was mine with the smallest possible drama beyond the truth. Yet still the smallest dramatics found their way in. Neighbors arrived with casseroles and folded faces. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived across the lane and had always arranged flowers for the church luncheon, declined an invitation to tea, and then lingered for a long while on the porch, hands clasped tight, like she could hold things together through proximity. Claire stopped by, she said, eyes soft but not unkind. She looked worried, said, "Well, you know how children worry." "How did she put it?" I asked. Mrs. Alvarez cocked her head. "She said you're forgetting things, Mr. Tom. She said you left the stove on twice. She thought you might not be safe alone." The words landed like pebbles. The people you expect to be your support network can become the chorus to someone else's story. Later that week, Mrs. Alvarez brought a small pie. "For you," she said. "If you need anything, call." I took the pie, thanked her, and felt the odd gratitude of being seen by someone who wasn't dividing me into assets. It warmed me, like the radiator when it kicks on after a long night. The antagonists of my small drama didn't only speak in words. They sent emissaries. An employee from the county called about a routine inspection for the chimney. "Just to be safe," she said cheerfully, and a social worker called once, asking questions about my daily routine. I answered politely, and then with the bluntness of someone protecting a perimeter. I live alone, I cook for myself, I go for walks, my neighbor checks in. I felt the netting tightening around me, not from legal threats, but from a creeping narrative that I might be less than I'd been. The worst part was that conversations in which my mental acuity was discussed included tones of concern designed to be protective and tones of a different kind, the clinical flatness people adopt when they're calculating whether someone should be moved to a safer place. At night I pored over the folder again. The deed, the mortgage statements, old tax receipts. They were small, boring things that carried a kind of thunder. I kept thinking of Lillian's scolding half-jest. "Don't give her so much that she forgets to be grateful." She meant Claire. She meant not to leave your children the impression that everything is theirs without an invitation. I'd tried to instill gratitude. It had not taken. When Claire actually came by, it was with a casserole and a softness I recognized as a practiced performance. She hugged me, The embrace was warm but precise. "We're worried about you, Dad," she said immediately, the words rehearsed like prayer. "You should consider a place where people can help more." "I'm asking you not to make decisions for me," I said. "I can manage. I've got things under control." Her eyes flashed for a second. "We only want you to be safe," she said. And because I'm not cruel by instinct, I softened. Not because her worry was an act, but because worry looks like love when you want it to be. After she left, I found an envelope behind the sugar canister with a note. "Please consider this for your safety." See, it was the sort of thing that wraps guilt around a person like a scarf. I put the note in the folder with the other papers and pretended not to notice the tiny betrayal. The sale wasn't instantaneous. Investors come with terms, assessments, contingencies. Daniel brought a few offers, and I considered them with the exacting caution of a man who had hammered nails straight for decades. One investor was brusque, hands moving like he was stacking bricks in his head. Another spoke softly, complimenting the garden and the maple. I watched their eyes appraise not my life, but the returns their money might make. I had to remind myself that I was doing the right thing for me. The right thing sometimes looks unkind through the eyes of children who expected inheritance as a promise. There were tests. The power company sent a notice about a meter read. A neighbor asked if I was sure about moving, the kind of question that tries to wedge a regret where a decision has been made. I had second thoughts. Would I miss the bay windows light? Would I live with the quiet of a small one-bedroom and the hum of other people's lives so close? Lillian's absence felt like another person in the room, and sometimes the pressure to keep the house for my children to return to for holidays was a real, tangible request that I could have satisfied by staying. But I kept thinking of that clipped voice on the phone, the way they'd spoken of selling the house as if they'd already cashed in. When the cash offer finally arrived, it was like watching a sky clear. The buyers would close in days. Daniel's efficiency became a blessing and a hammer. There was a notary, a stack of papers with legal type that smelled faintly of printer toner and bureaucracy. Alan sat across from me at the table in my kitchen, his suit a soft black and his hands folded like he'd done this 1,000 times. "It's your house, Tom," he said. It was a small, steadying truth. Signing the closing documents was an odd sensation. Each stroke of the pen felt both enormous and utterly mundane, the normality of signing your name at the bottom of a mortgage or a check. People think these acts are merely administrative, but with a pen, you move the angle of your life. I felt the weight of ink in my hand, the scratch against the page. Daniel slid the offer across. I signed. The notary stamped. The world arranged itself into a new order. But even as the legalities aligned, the emotional work continued. The house contains more than possessions. It holds patterns and ghosts. I packed slowly with the tedium and deliberate reverence of someone making a ritual out of leaving. Lillian's jewelry box. There was a sticky note on the underside where she'd listed the birthdays she liked to remember. I put her thimble into my pocket. The quilt she'd made for our daughter Claire. I folded it last, laid it carefully into a box labeled Delicate Keep. Each thing I packed felt like a tiny reclaiming. The night before the transfer, I did something small and childish. I sat in Lillian's chair and drank the last of the wine we had saved for something special. It was a habit of ours to save the better bottles for occasions that never arrived. After she was gone, I kept that ritual like a talisman. The apartment I'd rented at Meadowview Manor was modest, tidy, with a window that looked out on a communal lawn where retirees watered plants with solemn concentration. It was not the cabin they'd spoken of, but it was my choice. 2 days before closing, Claire and Adam cornered me in the kitchen. They came one after the other, Claire with that syrupy concern, Adam with a sort of brittle anger. It felt like interrogation and reconciliation braided into one. "You're really doing this?" Claire asked, eyes wide in a way I could not parse. Was it fear or feigned surprise? "Yes," I said. "I am. You can't do this to us," Adam said, the line in his voice used to marshal sympathy from rooms. "You're our father." "I'm still your father," I replied. "I'm not a house to be sold off when it's convenient." "I am making a choice. You're being selfish," Claire said. "That's not how families work." "Families aren't companies," I said, and the word was sharper than I intended. "Families aren't ledgers. You both have your lives. I have mine." They tried guilt, the oldest tool. "We'll look after you," they offered. "Just let us help." "Help isn't orders," I answered. "Help is asking first." Their faces went through the easy changes: disappointment, irritation, then the tried and true accusation that I was senile, irresponsible, a danger to myself. It hurts in a particular way when your loved ones treat you like a problem needing a solution. You begin to see yourself as they're describing you, and the image is unflattening. After they left, I sat at the dining table and read the folder again. I wanted to be careful. I wanted the sale to be clean. I wanted no loopholes, for reasons both practical and petty, because the idea of waking to a vacuum of ownership with no agency left to me made me dizzy. I arranged a surveillance camera disguised as a charger. I'm not proud of being secretive. I was being protective. I placed it so it would watch the front door. I tested it and then watched the little red light blink like an eye that would not sleep. A strange calm settled over me after that. Maybe it was the organization of it all, the pen strokes, the bank forms, the checklist with tasks crossed off like small victories. Or maybe it was the acknowledgement that I had finally done something for myself rather than for the credit line of gratitude. The night before the sale closed, I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. I thought of Lillian's voice, the warmth of her hand pressed to my back when I'd been up late working on a window frame. The house that had contained both love and small hurts would no longer be mine. That was a real loss, and there was a real grief there that had nothing to do with the behavior of my children. At 2 a.m, there was a crunch in the driveway. It was a small sound, a car door closing, a footstep on gravel, but it split the night like glass. My heart flipped into a little animal rhythm. I slid from the kitchen chair, moving without sound to the small charger camera, and pulled up a live feed on the phone. My breath came out thin. 2 figures stood by the porch light. Claire's hair was a dark silhouette in the glow. Adam's broad shoulders hunched forward like someone braced to take blame. They hesitated at the front walk, as if unsure if the door would welcome them. In the tiny window of the camera feed, I could see Claire reach into her bag and pull out a set of keys. She tried the handle. Nothing. She shook another set. Nothing. They exchanged looks that were equal parts baffled and angry. Claire's lips moved. Adam's jaw clenched. They were figuring it out. They were standing at the edge of a future they had assumed was guaranteed. and the guarantees had been quietly removed. For a second I watched them trying to decide whether to force the door or to leave it alone. The camera caught their faces, mouths forming words, and then the screen went black. Not because the camera flickered, but because outside, in the black, I heard them test a window. Footsteps on the sill. The soft sound of fabric as someone climbed. My chest tightened like a hand around a fist. They were going in. I did what my impulse told me and what prudence supported. I switched the camera off. I did not want an image of them breaking in the house that had been my life. I did not want to be a voyeur to their humiliation. I turned away from the screen and opened a bottle of the wine Lillian and I had saved. The cork came out with a pop that felt like a punctuation mark. I poured a glass and toasted the empty room. I thought about the line between justice and cruelty. I had not wanted to humiliate anyone. I had wanted control and dignity. But now, with the sound of their bodies in my house and the knowledge that they'd taken for granted the life I'd built, something cold and hard called for a reckoning. My hand shook as I raised a glass, and I felt both the sting of what I'd done and the clarity of it. They'd chosen assumptions and entitlement. I had chosen agency. The night blurred into morning. I slept in the spare room, a small mattress in the back of the house, where dust motes made the air look like snow. When I woke, the house smelled of stale breath and the faint ozone after a storm. The paper route had left the paper on the drive. The world outside continued its predictable cares, ignorant of the small, private earthquake that had happened inside my walls. When the title company called to say the funds were in the escrow account and the wire would clear that afternoon, a sharp focus hit me like cold water. There was still time for intervention. There was still the possibility of a last-minute enmeshment from my children, a plea, a promise. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers pressed into the grain, and thought of what would be fair. I thought of Lillian's voice. Don't give her so much that she forgets to be grateful. That phrase made the moral shape of my choice clearer. I had watched them speak of my life like an investment. I had not asked to be treated like a company resource. The clock on the wall ticked like a countdown. My chest felt both heavy and strangely light. And then my phone rang. I saw Claire's name. For a ridiculous half-second I considered not answering. The phone vibrated in my palm like a live thing, insistent. I tapped accept and held my breath. "Dad," she said, voice tightly polite. "We were just in the neighborhood. Could we come by, maybe talk?" Her invitation sounded ordinary, but the way her voice cracked near the end betrayed something else, anger, fear, or the first tug of panic. I kept my voice steady and let it be an even surface. "No," I said simply. "Not today." There was a pause on the line. "Dad, please, we can—" Her voice frayed into pleading. I said no, I repeated. "Please respect that." She hung up. The phone went dead and the house seemed to hold its breath. I set the receiver down and felt the weight of the moment like a hand on my shoulder. The wire, the signing, Lillian's ring in the drawer, the surveillance camera blinking red like a heartbeat. I had made my choice. The afternoon hung like a curtain about to be drawn. Daniel called to confirm the closing. Alan was on standby. The bank confirmed the wire. I had changed the locks with the locksmith who came early that morning, some quiet man with strong hands, who took my cash and did his work without questions. I'd packed the keys to the car and the box with Lillian's things into the trunk. As the sun slid west, the driveway crunched with tires again. I pulled the curtains aside just enough to peek. Claire and Adam stood at the gate, talking in low, urgent voices with someone who was clearly not a friend, a man in a suit, probably the one who'd advised them, and their faces were drawn in a way that told me the visors of charm had slipped. They looked at the house differently now, not as a home where their childhood sat waiting, but as a fortress that had closed the gate on what they'd assumed to be theirs. My heart hammered in a rhythm I recognized now as the last stamp of innocence, the moment right before a storm breaks and you know the thunder will call down the rest of the weather. The sale would close in hours. The house would no longer be where their entitlements could be anchored. The camera, small, unseemly, blinked on the table, its charge steady, its eye ready. I packed the last box slowly, as if savoring the small textures of the life I'd lived. Lillian's scarf, the paper-thin ribbon from our wedding bouquet, a children's drawing of a house in bright crayon that Claire had left on the fridge when she was 5. I folded it and slipped it into an envelope. There was a tug behind my ribs, equal parts grief and fierce, clean resolve. I walked to the front door, felt the new lock under my hand like an exclamation, and slid the letter I'd written into the inside of the door, where only someone entering would find it. The handwriting was small but firm. "Dear Claire and Adam," it said. "I heard your conversation about putting me in a nursing home and selling the house. The house has been sold for $825,000. The funds are in a secure account. I've moved to a place where I'm wanted. You have 30 days to claim what's in storage. I hope the lesson was worth the cost. Love, Dad." I taped the envelope carefully, the way you close a wound with neat stitches. It was honest and not cruel. It was a truth they could not ignore. If they came in through the window like thieves, as they'd already tried the night before, then the letter would be the first thing that would change their faces. I felt a strange butterfly buzz in my stomach, an anticipation tied not to vengeance, but to accountability. I slipped a small charger camera into my pocket, slid the keys to the car into my palm, and walked to the porch. The crunch of their footsteps grew louder. The gate creaked open. I stood on the stoop with the wind in my face, and for a second I let myself imagine the scene. 2 grown adults, face to face with the truth they had not bargained for, the blunt, legal truth that their plan had failed. I imagined Claire's anger turning into something else. I imagined Adam's calm shattering. The front walk was long. The final steps were the kind that pulled the rest of the story into place. I had done what I needed to do to be responsible for my life. I had taken the tools, the deed, the pen, the bank, and used them to carve a future that didn't include being shuffled aside. And then they rounded the corner of the porch. They looked up at me. Claire's eyes widened. Adam's face went slack. The moment hung there, as heavy and sharp as a held note. If you think this was the end of the story, the neat little bow that wraps everything up, you're wrong. This is the point where everything truly begins. There are reckonings and there are consequences. I stood on the porch with the letter in my pocket, the camera humming quietly in my hand, and I realized that there was one more thing I wanted, not just to be free, but to watch them confront the reality they had planned without me. They had assumed a future that did not include my agency. Now, right here, they would find out how wrong they were. When they stood on the porch that afternoon and saw me there, something in Claire's face shifted, confusion, then the sharpness of realization. Adam's jaw clenched like a hinge that had rusted and suddenly sprung. They expected the tantrum, the persuasion, maybe the slow bleed of guilt into compliance. Instead, they found a man who smelled faintly of sawdust and perfume, who had packed love into boxes and counted his signatures like safeguards. "I sold it," I said simply, the words steady. "It closed this morning." Claire's mouth opened and closed once, like a fish. You can't," she started, and the sentence wanted to catch fire but didn't. "You thought I was forgetful," I said. "You discussed putting me somewhere. You planned to sell the house without telling me, as if I were furniture." "I'm not furniture." For a moment they tried to reclaim the language of concern. "We only wanted what was best," Claire said, voice syrupy with its old coat of guilt. Adam tried a different tack. "This isn't the way to do things, Dad. You don't have to make enemies out of your children." Enemies. I let the word sit in the air like an accusation that could be turned. "I didn't want enemies," I said. "I wanted to be asked. I wanted my life to be treated like a life and not like an asset. You chose otherwise." They left after a few more stalled sentences, slamming the gate like a theater curtain. The slam echoed in my eardrums and left a punctuation mark on the day. I stood on the porch and watched until the car disappeared over the hill. The house hummed around me. The refrigerator's low drone, the ticking clock in the hallway, the distant bark of a dog. For the first time in a long while, the house's hum felt like something I'd earned by living in it. I had wanted control, and I had it. But I discovered something about revenge. The planning, the execution, those are satisfying in a practical way. But the real turning point is when you understand the moral lines you're willing to cross and the ones you won't. I told myself early on that I would not humiliate them publicly. I would not burn bridges I might want to cross again. The plan was surgical, legal, clean, unavoidable. After they drove away, I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd balanced budgets and birthday cards, and opened the folder one more time. The deed, the mortgage paid off years ago, the neat balance of paper proof. The title company's notification lay like a small, quiet verdict in my lap. I had a lawyer's voice inside me telling me not to gloat. My body wanted different things, relief first, then a bright, happy bell of vindication, but I softened it with patience. There were details to finish, boxes to move, a storage locker to rent for the things I couldn't hand over in good conscience. When it came to the logistics, I found that planning revenge is not cinematic. There were simple, clerical actions that had the weight of a hammer. I rented a storage unit at a facility I'd scoped out weeks earlier. It was a small place, locker style, with fluorescent lights and an attendant who nodded when I signed my name and piped a stale, perfumed, "Thank you, sir." I packed a single truckload. Lillian's quilts, the brass frame, the jars of buttons, the handcrafter thimble, Claire's crayon house drawing. I left a note taped to the inside of the storage door with my phone number and a line explaining they had 30 days to claim the box with proof of ID. Legally, I was required to give them access. Emotionally, I wanted to be the one who controlled the clock. 30 days is long enough to make panic useful and short enough to be meaningful. Next, bank logistics. Daniel and I had agreed on an escrow arrangement that placed funds in a secure account with limited withdrawal authorizations so that family members couldn't go after the money in ways that would entangle me. I worked with my lawyer to set up a trustee arrangement for managing immediate bills and a small stipend for me. I wasn't leaving everything to a steel box in the ground. I wanted to be safe. The money was a tool, not a prize. The surveillance camera, the cheap Charger model I bought online, felt like a guilty pleasure. I had set it because I wanted to watch without becoming voyeur. It had been a pragmatic tool to monitor whether people tried to move things before the closing. But as the buyer's representatives came and went, and as Daniel coordinated movers and a final walkthrough, I found myself checking the feed more than I should. There's a small, private thrill in watching the world continue without you being a child in it. You see the cracks, the little hurried hands, the lack of reverence. It's a cold kind of proof that may or may not be noble. There were many conflicts. A neighbor, Mr. Benson, came by with a casserole because he thought I might need help with moving. His eyes lingered on the boxes like someone peeking into a private room. He asked to borrow a ladder, and I let him, not out of necessity, but because I wanted to preserve a relationship with someone who hadn't turned my life into an accounting problem. We talked about flowers and the maple tree for a while, and the world felt for a second less brittle. Then there were the close calls that made me sweat and sharpened everything to a thin edge. Once, while I was at the bank, a woman, Claire, called and left a message that made the knot in my stomach tighten and the air go thin. "Dad, you have to talk to us. We're worried. Please call back," she said, and the tone was sticky with directive concern that felt like a trap. I didn't call back. I answered with silence. It was cruel in a careful, necessary way. Another time, Adam sent over an emissary, a friend of his, a man who used to fix our neighbor's fence. He knocked on the front door and introduced himself as a concerned friend who had heard about the sale. He tried to be gentle, saying things like, "We just want what's best." I invited him in for coffee and asked him about his own life until the conversation drifted away from me. It was a way to defuse the pressure and to remind myself that people can be kind even when they are being used as instruments of pressure. In the quiet parts, between the boxes and the calls, I worried about the emotional fallout. Would Claire's friends judge her? Would Adam lose a job because he'd been counting on money that was never theirs? Would I grow lonely in a Meadowview one-bedroom with the hum of the refrigerator as my new companion? These were real costs. Revenge isn't costless. It inhabits the space of moral consequence. I had to reconcile what I wanted from the outcome. At times I imagined them on their knees, begging for forgiveness. At other times I imagined them quietly resentful, calculating ways to re-enter my life like a parasite. But the thing I desired, the real, clean desire under it all, was not to watch them suffer. It was to be no longer their unsecured asset. It was to live with the dignity of making my decisions. That was my revenge, reclaiming autonomy. The final hours before closing had this peculiar geometry, compressed and elongated at once. Daniel coordinated the movers for a late afternoon slot. The escrow handler asked that I be present for the signing and the key exchange. I prepared myself in ways that surprised me. I ironed a shirt. I shaved. I sat for a long time in the light that came through the kitchen window, remembering Lillian folding napkins with exacting patience. The house echoed with the ghosts of small, ordinary rituals. When the buyer's team arrived, they walked through with a brisk confidence, hands in pockets, taking notes on things I'd cared about for decades. They touched the banister, admired the foundation, and spoke about updating the kitchen, which is another way of saying erasing what was. That stung more than I thought it would. The house was a palimpsest of life, and they were the erasers. Then came the moment we had been waiting for. Signatures, initials, a handful of notarized stamps. The pen felt heavy in my hand and light at the same time, like signing off a small, private contract with grief. Daniel clapped my back with professional warmth. Alan lit a cigarette out on the porch, a courtesy, a ritual. The wire confirmed on the phone, a digital chime that sounded like a bell. The house, for a split second, felt like it might slide off the map. I remember standing on the porch after the closing and thinking of all the small things I'd done to make a home. The time I fixed the porch light so Claire could come home from a late shift. The night I patched Adam's jacket with an inch of patience and thread. The 1,000 little gestures that people forget in the ledger of a life. I felt a loss so acute I thought I might fall into it. Then I breathed and felt a different presence, an ease like a heavy coat that had been pared off. On my way out, I left the letter taped inside the door. I wanted them to find it themselves. I wanted the truth to land in their hands the same way the deed had been handled. Factual, uncompromising, more uncomfortable than any speech I might have made on the porch. I packed the car slowly, feeling both greed for memory and a reverence for the past. Meadowview Manor looked small from the road, a neat little rectangle of windows and a shared garden where other people knit and gossip in equal measure. I felt a little foolish at first, a man in his 70s choosing a different life like a smaller house. But the foolishness wore off under the heat of something burning out and the warmth of a new possibility. The drive to Meadowview was quiet. I turned the radio on for a while and let it be background. The boxes in the back smelled faintly of dust and lavender. I kept thinking of the look on Claire's face when she realized I had legally secured the money and moved out. I kept thinking of Adam's jaw when he saw that the house's gate was no longer a given. For the first few nights in Meadowview, I slept like a man who had been given a reprieve. The mattress was different. The sounds through the thin walls, someone's television, a neighbor's kettle, were oddly comforting. I unpacked Lillian's quilts and placed the brass frame on the small table by the lamp. I called Alan and changed the trustee name so I could have a modest stipend for expenses. The money was not the point, safety was. But revenge, even when it's economically small and morally justified, leaves its traces. I thought I would feel triumphant. I felt something more complex, vindication braided with sadness. I had protected myself, but in doing so I had also removed myself from the home where my children had been raised. There's a cost to that, and I held it like a coin, valuable, small, and necessary. And then, as if the universe appreciates irony, the first knock came at the door of Meadowview. It was Mrs. Alvarez, hat on her head, pie tin in hand. "I brought you this," she said, as if the trip over the neighborhood was minor. She hugged me with all the warmth of a person who had no stake in family ledgers. "I'm sorry, Mr. Tom. Children, they do foolish things." We sat in the little common room, and she told me small neighbor stories about the church bake sale, about the time the maple tree lost a branch in a storm. Her kindness was a salve. She did not ask for details. She simply made tea and listened with eyes that saw me as a man who had done something hard. Word spreads, of course. By the end of the week there were rumors on porches and in the laundry room about the house on Maple Ridge and the shock sale. Some neighbors nodded in sympathetic ways. Some were more curious than kind. Claire's friends, People I'd met briefly here and there at family barbecues messaged me with vague condolences disguised as awkward small talk. News has a way of stretching and reshaping itself when told in neighborly quarters. Adam's reaction was delayed and messy. He called once, voice thick with something like regret, and asked about the storage unit. "Is there anything we can—" "We'll pay for storage." "We can?" I cut him off before the sentence could become a bargaining weapon. "The storage box has your things," I said. "You have 30 days to claim them." "You can't do that," he blurted. "You can't just—" I let him fluster. He was, after all, the same man who had planned to sell me out without a word. I felt a strange compassion for the confusion he had to grapple with, the sudden absence of an expected windfall. "You can move your items in within 30 days, I said. "Bring identification. If you want to talk about the past, come in 30 days. For now, this is what I chose." He hung up. I let the phone rest in silence like a closed book. Over the next few weeks, Claire and Adam's strategy shifted. First it was shock. Then it became negotiation. A friend of Claire's mother called and asked if there might be a family meeting. I declined. I had been clear about boundaries. I had done everything within the law and with the dignity I could manage. There were small community consequences, too. A pair of family friends, people who'd been at my wedding, stopped speaking to me on social media. Their posts became polite, distant. Another neighbor offered to watch my cat, which I found odd. I had not planned to be away. Some people made a choice to see my decision as a betrayal. Others, like Mrs. Alvarez, saw it as a man protecting the last piece of dignity in his life. There's an unexpected cruelty in how quickly an act like mine can be turned into rumor. People love to reduce complexity into sound bites. "He kicked out his kids," someone said at the post office, though I had never kicked them out. "He sold the family home. The shorthand is brutal." In truth, I had refused to be erased. One day, about a week after I moved, a car stopped by Madoview, and a woman in a suit stepped out. She introduced herself as a friend of Claire's who had been sent to check on me. Her manner was professional, soft-edged. She spoke in the language of concern and policy. "We just wanted to make sure you're safe," she said, and there it was again. Safety, the newest currency used to dismantle agency. I invited her for tea, and we spoke for an hour. I told her small truths in measured doses. I have my paperwork I am managing. I have friends like Mrs. Alvarez. She listened and nodded, and at the end she gave me a card and asked me to call if I changed my mind about family mediation. I put the card under Lillian's framed photo, like a small, neat bookmark. The turning point wasn't one blaring proclamation. It was a slow, continuous line of choices that kept me anchored. Faith in the law, a willingness to relinquish what I'd built if it meant keeping my autonomy, and the acceptance of the moral cost that comes with reclaiming agency. The revenge I'd planned wasn't about punishment. It was about consequence. They had assumed and arranged without my consent. I made them face that assumption. I watched them from a distance as the 30 days ticked down. I could see panic twitching in their phone calls and their sudden attempts at civility. I also saw something I hadn't expected, a gradual, awkward self-examination. Claire called one evening, voice small and strained. "Dad," she started, and then stopped. Can we talk? Not about the house, about us." I did not answer that night. I wanted them to understand that apologies are not a currency that erases. They are gestures that must be earned. If they wanted to rebuild trust, it would be a slow stitch, not a magic eraser, and so I waited, watched, and kept living. I went to bingo at Meadowview, made a friend with a woman named Gail who taught me how to make lemon bars, and went for walks in the park where people let their dogs off leashes, like they trusted the world to hold them. My life filled with ordinary things again, small joys that were not supposed to be trophies, but were nevertheless precious. The revenge was no longer an idea. It had become a weathered fact. They had to contend with it. They had to look at their choices in the mirror of consequence. That more than any sting I could inflict felt like a kind of justice. The 30 days I'd sat on the storage locker felt like a quiet metronome, counting down not the death of things, but the possibility of reconciliation. I knew some part of them, maybe Claire's, maybe Adam's, would come for what belonged to them. I also knew some part of them might let it slide, assuming the effort wasn't worth the pain. Human beings are lazy in precise ways when it comes to inconvenient truth. The day they came for the storage unit, the sky was a clear, brittle blue. I drove separately, because the point was not to gloat. The point, if there had to be one, was to watch with the measured interest of a man who had done what he thought right. Claire arrived first, breathless and in a jacket that looked too new for worry. Adam was behind her, expression guarded. They walked with a choreography I knew well, the one children learn when they think they are reclaiming what was their due. The attendant opened the unit with a polite nod. The boxes were stacked like a small life, labeled with dates and names and small notations that only someone who'd lived a life with my partner would understand. Claire moved quickly, hands searching for the crayon house, the brass frame. When she found the drawing, she hesitated. Pride and shame warred across her face. "I only took it once," she said awkwardly, as if admitting to a childhood theft would mollify the decades of entitlement. "You left it on the fridge," I said. "You left it because you were 5 and not because it was a claim on my life." Her hands trembled slightly as she took the picture and smoothed it with the fingertips of someone suddenly aware of the fragility of paper. Adam found Lillian's quilt and held it like a relic. His face went soft, one of those rare moments where the armor drops and a human being is visible in the crevices. For a second I thought, irrationally, that perhaps this would be the turning point, a raw, shared memory that would stitch us back together. But life is more tangled than that. After they'd taken what they wanted and left, there was an awkward lull. I sat in my car and watched them drive away, the boxes in their trunk, like trophies that had lost their sheen. The lesson had been delivered. The sting had been felt, but it was not a cinematic collapse. It was a small human thing. Collections of objects in the hands of people who had thought they would inherit a life without accounting for the currency of trust. News traveled, of course. Claire's social circle buzzed, and the gossip did what gossip does best. It squinted the story into something sharper and meaner, and then handed it out like candy. "Oh, they were absolutely terrible," someone said. "He deserved it," another said. Public opinion is a blunt instrument that loves a tidy moral tale. But in the kitchen of a one-bedroom apartment in Meadowview, I found a quieter audience. Neighbors who had perhaps suspected entitlement might be at work, but had never seen a family ledger made public like this. A week after the storage visit, a letter came from Claire. I opened it with the care of someone who opens old photographs. She wrote with a shaky script. The letter had apologies, the kind that tries to stitch a torn fabric by only looking at the hole. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen like that. We were scared about money. We thought—" The pen faltered. Under her apology came practical logistics. She asked about splitting certain heirlooms and about whether there might be a way to reconcile. Her letter was a small, noisy thing that smelled faintly of perfume. It wanted both absolution and access. I sent a brief note back. "If you want to talk, I'm willing to meet. On my terms." That was honest and maybe a little cold. Good. Time deserves honesty. Adam's response was slower, wrapped in a man's difficulty with words. He called twice and left messages that amounted to near pleas. He promised to be better, to come by more often, to help with errands. I listened to them all and kept a careful distance. Promises can be made from convenience. Actions are the real currency. In the community, their reputations shifted. People chose sides, not always in obvious ways. Some reached out to me with sympathy and casseroles. Others quietly unfriended us at social functions, as if the mere proximity of my name was taboo. Claire's circle fractured in places, and there were awkward silences at gatherings where I once assumed I'd be welcomed. But there's a subtler fallout that's harder to witness. The way relationships change when they are no longer governed by an assumption of access. My friends at Meadowview, a ragtag assortment of retirees and a woman who worked at the library, started showing up at my door with small things. A loaf of sourdough, a jar of jam, a laugh that didn't require inventory. They had no stake in my family's drama. Their kindness was uncomplicated. It felt, in a way, more honest than the love that had been conditioned on my financial amenability. Months passed. The buyer renovated the house, the sort of casual erasure I'd expected. New shutters appeared, the porch light changed, the maple's lower limbs were trimmed. I drove by once and felt like a historian passing a renovated ruin. The house looked younger in a way that meant all the old scars were smoothed away. It paid to own a wound like a memory. I thought, "You keep the ache, but the new paint makes the outside more pleasant." One evening, as autumn turned the leaves to fire, Claire came by. Not with the jabbed entitlements of a kid who's certain of her inheritance, but as someone who'd lived through the consequences and wanted something else. Her hair was shorter. She looked both familiar and strangely transformed. We sat at the small table in my apartment. She kept her hands folded like someone trying not to get swept by old tidal currents. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, not soaring but steady. "We were scared and we acted out of fear." I listened. It is a strange thing to watch the child who once believed the world owed her a cabin become someone who understands the depth of a father's chosen solitude. She spoke about nights lying awake and thinking about the ethics of care, about how their friends had reacted, about the odd pity that had never sat right. "I won't pretend it's an excuse," she added. "I didn't understand. Words, even brave ones, can be small things." I did not offer immediate forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a switch to be flipped for convenience. But I did offer conversation, a bridge built of many small boards. We talked into the night about Lillian's laugh, the recipe for lemon bars that had been in the family for generations, about what it felt like to have grown up in a house that smelled of lemon and wood shavings. There was grief there on both sides, for the lost years, for the ways we'd failed each other. Reckoning is not just about consequences. It's about the work that follows. There were hard conversations about boundaries and money and what we owed each other as family members who still wanted to be in each other's lives. Adam called more often. He showed up to fix a leaky faucet at Meadowview and left with hands that had learned humility. It took months, small acts for the rough edges to be sanded down, but there is a more public aftermath too. Word of my sale and the family drama traveled into the world in unkind angles. Some people applauded me for asserting my rights. Others accused me of cruelty. Human beings are messy, and internet morality is even messier. Some young people posted viral threads with screen grabs of my letter and debates about elder autonomy and family responsibility. The hottest arguments always boil down to two questions. Who decides what's best for someone who is aging? And at what point does love require us to give up what we've built? Those debates are useful in that they force us to examine culture's assumptions. I found myself invited to talk to a small community group about elder independence. I told my story bluntly, not to seek approval, but to offer an ethical map. Protect your rights, keep your paperwork in order, and do not assume your kindness is an enduring mortgage on your life. The room listened with the kind of attention that makes you feel like your experience matters beyond the immediate family drama. One night, long after the dust had settled and the maple's leaves had fallen, Claire and Adam came by together. The air had a crispness in it that made their breath visible as short, white columns. They were quieter, kinder. We stood in the small living room, and I saw something shift. Not the restoration of the past, but the cautious building of a new present. "Dad," Adam said eventually, "we were wrong. We thought we were protecting you. We didn't understand that we were talking about taking your life. You spoke about selling the house like a plan," I said. "It wasn't just the money, it was the assumption," he nodded. "We get that now. If you'll have us, we want to be part of your life, but we'll do it by your rules." They came to dinners occasionally. They helped me hang a new curtain. They learned, slowly, the difference between obligation and presence. It's not a clean restoration, scars survive, but the honest effort is its own kind of healing. Some people move on. Some people are steady enough to stay. A neighbor once told me, months after the sale, that she had seen Claire at the grocery store looking tired and embarrassed. She looked like someone who'd finally learned what humility costs, Mrs. Alvarez said. It's a hard lesson. The ultimate fallout included other things I hadn't expected. The buyer's renovations had increased the value of the property by a healthy margin. I was for a brief period the subject of envy in a way that felt grotesque. People would talk about my windfall as if I had stuck a dagger into my children for sport. Money obscures more than it illuminates. It can make people forget the small reasons you made the choices you did. And yet, and this is important, I found a measure of peace. There are mornings where I wake up and the house I live in now feels small and perfectly sized, like a shirt that fits well after years of wearing one that was too large. I drink coffee at a table with a lamp and a photo of Lillian, and the world is gentle enough that I can let grief sit beside me without letting it rule me. The revenge I enacted was not a blood sport. It was, in its way, an act of self-preservation given a moral backbone. There were times I wondered whether I had been cruel in a way that extended beyond the bounds of reasonable defense. But then I remember the conversation I overheard, the laughter about a cabin, the calm voice discussing logistics as if I were already disposed of. People like us deserve the dignity of choice. You can't build a life and then have it auctioned away without your consent. Not if you value the moral texture of being seen. The final chapter of the story didn't look like a courtroom drama or a sensational public collapse. It looked like a series of quiet acts. A letter, a wire transfer, a storage locker, a phone call that finally turned into a real conversation about care. Claire and Adam did not become perfect. They became human again, a flawed, earnest kind of human that after the lesson of consequence was willing to try. If you've stayed with me this long, you know the practical parts of what I did. I verified the title, I consulted a lawyer, I sold the house on my terms, and I moved to a smaller place, keeping the things that mattered. But the deeper lesson, the part worth putting at the center of this story, is that dignity is not a thing others can grant you. It is something you have to assert. I did not want to teach my children to suffer. I wanted to teach them to ask. I wanted to teach them that generosity is not an invitation to take. I wanted to protect the memory of Lillian and the life we built without letting a moment of kindness become a perpetual sentence. If there's a moral I leave you with, it's this: keep your paperwork. Know your rights. Don't let anyone assume they control your future because you once helped them. And more importantly, hold your boundaries with the firm, compassionate hand of someone who understands that love does not mean forfeiture. I learned something else, something quieter. People who betray or take for granted the generosity of others are rarely monsters. They are usually people who are scared and short-sighted. Their mistakes can stem from fear as much as from entitlement. Recognize that, and you will find it easier to choose remedies that reclaim your dignity without becoming the kind of person you'll regret being. If this one hit you, if you've ever been taken for granted or felt like someone counted your kindness like money in a ledger, hit like, subscribe, and share your story below. Tell me, what would you have done in my shoes? Let's have a conversation about dignity, family, and the hard choices that keep us human. If you want more stories like this, stick around. I'll bring you real tales from real people who took their lives back, one hard, honest choice at a time. Thanks for listening, and remember, protect what you've built, and don't let anyone decide your ending for you.